Number 1. Danielle Jones and Stuart Campbell, the uncle who sent texts from a dead girl's phone. There are crimes that shake an entire nation, and then there are crimes that fundamentally change the way investigators understand evidence forever. The case of 15-year-old Danielle Sarah Jones, a schoolgirl from East Tilbury in Essex, England, belongs to both categories. Danielle was born on the 16th of October, 1985, and by all accounts she was a bright, cheerful teenager who was loved deeply by her parents Tony and Linda Jones, and by the wider community around her. She attended St. Clair's School in Stamford-le-Hope and was known among her friends and teachers as a warm and energetic young person with her whole life ahead of her. On the morning of the 18th of June, 2001, Danielle left her family home at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning to walk to her local bus stop and catch a ride to school, a journey she had taken hundreds of times before without any incident. She never arrived at school that day. She never came home. And from that morning forward, despite one of the largest missing person investigations in British history involving over 900 police officers and support staff searching more than 1,500 locations across Essex and beyond, Danielle Jones was never seen alive again, and her body has never been found to this day. What made this case so extraordinary, so haunting, and ultimately so significant to the history of criminal justice was not just the tragedy of a young girl disappearing on an ordinary Tuesday morning, but the way in which her killer was ultimately brought to justice through a form of evidence that had never before been used in a British murder trial: forensic authorship analysis of text messages sent from Danielle's own mobile phone. The man convicted of taking Danielle's life was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was her uncle by marriage, a builder named Stuart James Campbell, born on the 21st of February, 1958, who had been a presence in Danielle's family for years. Investigators began focusing their suspicion on Campbell almost immediately after Danielle's disappearance, and he was first arrested just 5 days later on the 23rd of June, 2001. During the initial period after Danielle vanished, witnesses reported seeing a teenage girl matching Danielle's description speaking with a man near a blue Ford Transit van on Coronation Avenue, which was along the route she would have taken toward the bus stop, and Campbell owned a blue Ford Transit van of the same type. Campbell was described by investigators as deeply uncooperative during police interviews, and in one recorded 20-minute session he refused to answer 50 separate questions put to him by detectives. Despite the early suspicion, releasing Campbell with insufficient direct evidence was a calculated risk, as authorities considered the possibility that Danielle might still be alive and that rushing an arrest could endanger her. By the 17th of August, 2001, however, after finding what police described as significant evidence, Campbell was re-arrested on suspicion of murder. A search of Campbell's home and his loft space produced a canvas bag containing blood-stained white stockings, and forensic DNA analysis confirmed that genetic material on those stockings belonged to both Danielle Jones and to Stuart Campbell himself. Officers also found camera equipment and materials in the property that raised serious concern about the nature of Campbell's interest in young girls. A police superintendent told the BBC that Campbell had developed a relationship with Danielle that was, in their words, certainly inappropriate and probably unlawful, and that Danielle had apparently been attempting to distance herself from him in the period before she disappeared. The Crown Prosecution Service made the bold and unusual decision on the 14th of November, 2001, to proceed with a murder prosecution even without a body, acknowledging that securing a conviction under those circumstances would be exceptionally difficult but that the evidence available was sufficient to justify the attempt. Campbell's trial opened at Chelmsford Crown Court on the 14th of October, 2002, and it would last 11 weeks and rest on a chain of circumstantial evidence that was carefully and methodically constructed by the prosecution team. The most remarkable and groundbreaking element of the prosecution's case concerned the text messages that had been sent from Danielle's mobile phone in the hours and days following her disappearance. After Danielle vanished on the morning of the 18th of June, 2001, a number of text messages were sent from her phone to family members, and investigators noted that these messages seemed unusual in their tone, phrasing, and vocabulary. Danielle's family and friends immediately recognized that something was wrong with those messages, that they did not sound the way Danielle spoke or wrote, that the language felt unfamiliar and the emotional register was somehow off. Investigators brought in a team of forensic linguists, specialists in the study of language patterns and authorship, and asked them to conduct a rigorous scientific comparison between the text messages sent from Danielle's phone after her disappearance and samples of writing known to have been composed by Stuart Campbell. The linguists examined the vocabulary, the sentence structures, the punctuation habits, the spelling tendencies, and dozens of other measurable characteristics of written language, and their conclusion was that the post-disappearance text messages from Danielle's phone bore the linguistic fingerprints of Stuart Campbell, not of Danielle Jones herself. This analysis, which had never previously been used as evidence in a British criminal trial, told investigators and ultimately the jury a devastating story. That Campbell had taken Danielle's phone after she disappeared and had been using it to send messages designed to make her family believe she was still alive, still free, still choosing not to come home, when in reality she was already gone. The prosecution also presented cell phone records that directly contradicted Campbell's stated alibi for the morning of the 18th of June, and combined with the DNA evidence from the blood-stained stockings and the eyewitness accounts placing Danielle near a van matching Campbell's near the bus stop, the case built against him was formidable. On the 19th of December, 2002, the jury returned a guilty verdict, convicting Stuart Campbell of both the abduction and murder of Danielle Jones. Judge McKinnon, in delivering the sentence, addressed Campbell directly, telling him that he had done a truly terrible thing that had caused widespread horror and disgust, and that Campbell was a dangerous man. Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder, with a minimum term of 20 years to be served before he could be considered for parole, alongside a concurrent 10-year sentence for the abduction. The conviction without a body was extraordinarily rare in British legal history, and the use of forensic authorship analysis of text messages sparked significant academic and legal research into the methodology and its potential application in other cases. Researchers at the University of Leicester later published work directly inspired by the Danielle Jones case examining the scientific standards and limitations of text message authorship analysis. As of today, Danielle's body has never been located. Campbell has been referred to the parole board and his potential release has been fiercely opposed by Danielle's family, particularly her mother Linda Jones, who has publicly stated that she does not believe Campbell should ever be freed unless he reveals the location of her daughter's remains. Essex police have conducted multiple searches over the years, including a 2017 excavation at a garage area in Stifford Clays following what was described as a credible lead, but no trace of Danielle has ever been found. The Jones family continues to live with the particular cruelty of a case that was solved in a courtroom but never fully resolved in their hearts, because the one thing they have always needed most, the chance to bring their daughter home and lay her to rest, remains beyond their reach. Number 2. Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy, the text messages that ordered a young man to die. In the summer of 2014, in the quiet coastal town of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, an 18-year-old young man named Conrad Roy III sat alone in his pickup truck in the parking lot of a Kmart store and lost his life in circumstances that would ignite a national debate about the power of words, the nature of criminal responsibility, and whether a text message could constitute a deadly weapon. Conrad Roy III was by all accounts a kind and sensitive young person who had grown up in Fairhaven with his family and who had struggled for years with depression and suicidal thoughts, a battle that was known to those close to him and for which he had sought some degree of help over the years. He was 18 years old at the time of his death, the son of Conrad Roy Jr., and a young man described by his family as their best friend, a devoted brother, a person who brought warmth and humor into every room he entered. The young woman at the center of this case was Michelle Carter, who was 17 years old at the time of the events that led to Conrad's death and who had grown up in the town of Plainville, Massachusetts, roughly 30 miles from Fairhaven. Carter and Roy had met in Florida in 2012 during a family vacation and had maintained what was primarily a long-distance relationship conducted almost entirely through text messages, phone calls, and online communication, as the two rarely met in person despite their ongoing emotional connection. Those who knew Carter described her as someone who desperately wanted to be liked and accepted, someone who placed enormous importance on how she appeared to others, and investigators would later come to understand that this need for social approval played a significant and troubling role in the tragedy that unfolded. In the months leading up to July 2014, Conrad Roy had been communicating with Carter about his mental health struggles, including his thoughts about ending his life, and rather than consistently steering him away from those thoughts and toward professional help, Carter's responses to his messages became increasingly disturbing in their encouragement. Over the course of thousands of text messages exchanged between the two teenagers, A deeply troubling pattern emerged in which Carter appeared to not only accept Roy's plans to take his own life, but to actively encourage them, to suggest methods, to express frustration when he hesitated, and to pressure him when he expressed second thoughts or fear. Prosecutors would later present evidence showing that Carter sent Roy messages telling him that he needed to stop overthinking it, that he was ready, that he just needed to follow through, and that the more he delayed the worse it would be for him emotionally. On the evening of the 12th of July, 2014, Conrad Roy was in his pickup truck with a water pump connected to the exhaust system, filling the cab with carbon monoxide in what had been planned as his method of ending his life, and Carter was on the phone with him. At some point during that phone call, Roy got out of the truck. He was scared. The gas was working and he stepped outside into the fresh air. This moment where a young man physically removed himself from a situation designed to end his life, was the moment that would become the centerpiece of the entire criminal case against Michelle Carter. According to a text message that Carter sent to a friend named Samantha Boardman in September 2014, nearly 2 months after Conrad's death, Carter had been on the phone with Roy when he got out of the truck, and she told him to get back in. She wrote to her friend that she could have stopped him, that she was on the phone with him, and that he got scared and got out of the car because it was working, but that she told him to get back in. Conrad Roy returned to the truck. He never came out again. His body was found the following morning by police in the Kmart parking lot. The medical examiner ruled his death a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Initially, no one questioned the nature of his death, because on its surface it appeared to be a tragic but straightforward case of a young man with a documented history of mental health struggles taking his own life. But investigators began to look more closely at Roy's phone, and what they found inside it changed the entire character of the inquiry. Over 4,000 text messages between Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter were recovered from the devices, and as investigators read through them, the picture that emerged was deeply concerning. Carter had not simply been a bystander to Roy's distress. She had been an active and persistent voice urging him toward death, expressing frustration at his delays, suggesting methods, and framing suicide as the solution to his suffering in message after message over a period of weeks. In 2015, Carter was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. The case immediately became one of the most discussed and legally contentious true crime matters in the United States, because Carter's defense team argued that her words, even those encouraging Roy to end his life, were protected speech under the First Amendment, and that no physical act by Carter had caused Roy's death. The prosecution countered that Carter's virtual presence had been so overwhelming, her pressure so constant and so targeted, that she had effectively overridden Roy's own will to survive, and that her command to get back in the truck at the precise moment when he had chosen to save himself was the direct and proximate cause of his death. Carter opted to be tried before a judge rather than a jury, and the case was heard in Bristol County Juvenile Court because Carter had been 17 at the time of the offense. The trial took place in June 2017, and Judge Lawrence Moniz heard extensive readings from the text message exchanges, considered the testimony of experts, and examined the arguments of both sides carefully before delivering his verdict. On the 16th of June, 2017, Judge Moniz found Michelle Carter guilty of involuntary manslaughter. In explaining his ruling, the judge stated that Carter had instructed Roy to get back into the truck well knowing all of the feelings he had expressed to her, his ambivalence, his fears, his concerns, and that her virtual presence had overwhelmed his willpower to the point where but for her admonishments, pressure, and instructions, Roy would not have returned to the truck and would not have lost his life that night. Carter was sentenced to 2.5 years in a correctional facility, with 15 months to be served and the remainder suspended, followed by 5 years of probation. She was allowed to remain free while her attorneys pursued appeals through the state courts, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ultimately upheld her conviction. Carter began serving her sentence in February 2019 and was released in January 2020 after approximately 11 months, having received credit for good behavior. Her probation concluded in August 2022. The Roy family endured the entire ordeal with extraordinary public dignity, with Conrad's sister Camden describing her brother in her victim impact statement as the best friend and role model any little sister could ask for, and his father expressing the depths of a grief that no parent should ever have to carry. In the years since the case concluded, the story of Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter has been the subject of a Hulu limited series, multiple documentaries, an ongoing academic and legal debate about the boundaries of criminal responsibility in the digital age. The question of whether words alone can kill, and whether a teenager sending text messages from 30 miles away can be held accountable for a death she did not physically cause, remains one of the most profound and unsettling legal questions to emerge from the era of constant digital communication. Number 3. Aaron Hernandez and Odin Lloyd, the NFL star whose text sealed his own fate. There are few stories in the history of American professional sports that carry the particular weight and tragedy of the story of Aaron Joseph Hernandez, a man who appeared to have everything the world could offer and who lost all of it because of choices he made and the text messages those choices left behind. Aaron Hernandez was born on the 6th of November, 1989, in Bristol, Connecticut, and from an early age it was clear that he possessed an extraordinary athletic talent. He grew up in a household that was by his own later account complicated and difficult, and the death of his father Dennis Hernandez when Aaron was just 16 years old left a wound in him that he would carry for the rest of his life. Despite the personal turbulence of his early years, Hernandez's abilities on the football field were undeniable, and he went on to become one of the most celebrated tight ends in the history of college football at the University of Florida, where he was part of a national championship team and played alongside legends of the sport. He was selected by the New England Patriots in the 4th round of the 2010 NFL Draft and quickly became one of the most exciting young offensive weapons in the entire National Football League, playing alongside quarterback Tom Brady and alongside fellow tight end Rob Gronkowski in what was one of the most potent offensive combinations the game had ever seen. By 2012, Hernandez had signed a contract extension with the Patriots worth $40 million over 5 years, a deal that made him one of the highest-paid tight ends in the history of professional football, and that appeared to secure his future at the highest level of the sport for years to come. But behind the public image of a celebrated athlete living a life of wealth and success, those close to Hernandez knew that he carried a different world within him, one marked by associations that were deeply troubling, by a volatile temperament, and by a pattern of behavior that created serious concern among people who cared about him. Odin Lloyd was a 27-year-old semi-professional football player from the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston who played for a team called the Boston Bandits, and who was known to those who loved him as a hard-working, good-natured young man. Lloyd had come to know Aaron Hernandez through a connection that bound the two men together in the most ordinary social way. Lloyd was in a relationship with Shania Jenkins, who was the sister of Shayana Jenkins, Hernandez's own fiancée. The two men moved in overlapping social circles in the Boston area, and on the surface their relationship appeared unremarkable. On the night of the 16th of June, 2013, Aaron Hernandez sent a series of text messages to two friends, Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, telling them to get themselves up to Massachusetts urgently. Surveillance footage from Hernandez's home in North Attleboro captured the three men together at the property. Later that same evening, Hernandez sent a text message to Odin Lloyd telling him he wanted to get together. In the early hours of the 17th of June, 2013, a car went to Lloyd's home in Dorchester and collected him from outside his residence. In what would become the most significant text message of the entire case, Lloyd sent a message to his sister before getting into the car that read simply, "Did you see who I left with? NFL." Odin Lloyd, it appeared, understood that he was with someone connected to the NFL, and investigators would conclude that this was a reference to Aaron Hernandez, the only NFL player Lloyd knew. It was the last message Odin Lloyd ever sent. His body was found later that morning of the 17th of June, 2013, in an industrial park not far from Hernandez's home in North Attleboro. He had been shot multiple times. Police descended on Hernandez's property within days, and what they found when they examined the evidence painted an extraordinarily damaging picture. Surveillance footage from Hernandez's own home security system showed Hernandez with what appeared to be a firearm inside the house after Lloyd had been collected. Phone records and cell tower data meticulously tracked the movements of Hernandez, Wallace, and Ortiz throughout the night and into the early morning hours of the 17th, placing them precisely where the prosecution's timeline required. The text messages that Hernandez had exchanged with Wallace in the days before the crime were recovered, including messages referring to a clip and using deeply troubling language that prosecutors argued was evidence of planning and intent. A Sprint telecommunications representative testified at trial about deleted texts recovered from Hernandez's phone, showing a pattern of urgent communication with Wallace in the hours surrounding Lloyd's death. Hernandez had also sent a text message to his fiancée Shayana Jenkins from the police station in the early hours of the 18th of June, directing her to a box located behind a screen in their home theater room, which investigators believed was a coded instruction to dispose of a firearm, and Jenkins later testified that she had removed and disposed of a box from the home. Hernandez had also destroyed his home surveillance hard drive and hired a cleaning crew for the property in the days following Lloyd's death. Actions that prosecutors argued were clear evidence of a consciousness of guilt. He was arrested on the 26th of June, 2013, at his home in North Attleboro, and the New England Patriots released him from the team the same day. The trial for the murder of Odin Lloyd began on the 29th of January, 2015, in Fall River, Massachusetts, and lasted for 3 months, drawing national and international attention every single day of its proceedings. The prosecution's case was built around the layered tapestry of digital evidence, including text messages, cell tower records, surveillance footage, and phone records, all of which together painted a picture so comprehensive that it left almost no room for an innocent interpretation. On the 15th of April, 2015, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, and Aaron Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence under Massachusetts law for a first-degree murder conviction. He was held at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts. 2 years later, on the 19th of April, 2017, just days after being acquitted of separate murder charges related to a 2012 double homicide in Boston, Aaron Hernandez was found in his prison cell having taken his own life. He was 27 years old. Subsequent examination of Hernandez's brain revealed that he had been suffering from an advanced form of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain disease associated with repeated head impacts, which sparked significant debate about the relationship between the disease, the NFL, and the behavioral changes that may have contributed to his downfall. Odin Lloyd's family, his mother Ursula Ward, and those who loved him, were left to grieve a son and a brother who had done nothing to deserve what happened to him, a young man whose final text message, NFL, has become one of the most haunting pieces of digital evidence in the history of American crime. Number 4, Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander, the deleted photos and messages that exposed a killer's lies. There are cases that capture the attention of an entire nation, and then there are cases that become something larger, a cultural moment that forces society to examine the nature of obsession, deception, and the permanent digital footprint that modern technology leaves behind even when someone tries desperately to erase it. The case of Jodi and Arias and the death of Travis Victor Alexander is precisely that kind of case. A story that unfolded over years of courtroom drama and media saturation, and that ultimately came to rest on digital evidence that Arias believed she had destroyed beyond recovery. Travis Alexander was born on the 28th of July, 1977, in Riverside, California, and had grown up in difficult circumstances before finding direction and purpose through his faith, and through his work as a motivational speaker and salesman with a company called Prepaid Legal Services. By the time he was in his early 30s, Alexander was living in Mesa, Arizona, had built a circle of close friends, was active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and was regarded by those who knew him as an energetic, ambitious, and generous person who had worked hard to build a meaningful life out of a challenging beginning. Jodi and Arias was born on the 9th of July, 1980, in Salinas, California, and had developed a passion for photography from a young age. She and Travis Alexander met in September of 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the two quickly developed an intense connection. By November of that same year, Arias had been baptized into Alexander's faith, and by early 2007 the two were in a romantic relationship. The relationship between Arias and Alexander was, by the accounts of those who knew them, both a complicated and volatile one, marked by deep emotional intensity on both sides, but also by tensions and conflicts that escalated over time. The couple ended their formal relationship in the summer of 2007, but they continued to maintain contact and a physical relationship in the period that followed, even as Alexander began dating other women and even as he expressed to friends a growing unease about Arias's behavior toward him, including concerns that she had been going through his belongings, monitoring his communications, and making appearances at locations he had not told her he would be at. In April of 2008, Alexander had made arrangements to travel to Cancun, Mexico for a work trip and had originally planned to bring Arias with him, but he changed his mind in the weeks before the trip and instead invited another woman, a friend named Mimi Hall. On the 4th of June, 2008, Travis Alexander was found by his friends in his home in Mesa, Arizona, after they became concerned when he failed to respond to calls and messages for several days. He had been killed in his bathroom. He had suffered 27 stab wounds, a cut across his throat, and a single gunshot wound to his head. The injuries indicated an extended and desperate struggle. Alexander had been 30 years old. Jodi Arias initially denied any involvement in Alexander's death when investigators spoke to her, claiming she had not been at his home on the day he was killed. When confronted with the fact that her palm print had been found in blood at the crime scene and that her hair had also been recovered there, she changed her story, telling a television program that she had witnessed two masked intruders enter the home and attack Alexander while she was visiting. 2 years after her arrest, in a third version of events, Arias claimed that she had in fact been present and had been responsible for Alexander's death, but that she had acted entirely in self-defense after he attacked her in a violent rage. The digital evidence that dismantled every one of these stories and revealed the truth of what had happened was found in the most unexpected of places. A digital camera that had been placed inside Alexander's washing machine and run through a wash cycle in what investigators concluded was Arias's attempt to destroy the evidence it contained. Forensic technicians retrieved the camera from the washing machine and used data recovery tools to bring back photographs that had been stored on its memory card despite the attempt to erase them. What they recovered was extraordinary. There were time-stamped photographs showing Travis Alexander alive in his shower at 5:29 in the afternoon of the 4th of June, 2008. There were photographs taken moments later, during the attack itself, that appeared to have been captured accidentally as the camera was dropped or moved during the struggle, and which placed Arias at the scene beyond any question. There was a photograph taken at 5:41 in the afternoon, just 12 minutes after the shower photographs, that showed Alexander on the floor of his bathroom. The camera's timestamp told the story of those 12 minutes in a way that no witness could have done. In addition to the photographs, forensic examination of the digital devices belonging to both Arias and Alexander recovered thousands of text messages and emails that the prosecution used to establish the nature and history of their relationship, showing the volatility, the tensions, and what prosecutors argued was a pattern of behavior consistent with jealousy, possessiveness, and ultimately premeditation. The text message and email record also directly contradicted key elements of Arias's claim of self-defense by showing the content of communications between the two in the days leading up to Alexander's death. Arias was arrested on the 9th of July, 2008, which was also her 28th birthday, at her grandparents' home in Wairika, California, and was extradited to Arizona. Her booking photograph from that arrest, in which she smiled broadly for the camera, became one of the most widely discussed and circulated mugshots in the modern history of American criminal cases, an image that many observers found deeply unsettling precisely because of its contrast with the nature of what she had been charged with. The trial of Jodi Arias began in January of 2013 and lasted for 64 days, during which it was broadcast live to millions of viewers across the United States and became one of the most watched courtroom proceedings in American television history. The jury heard from 174 witnesses and examined hundreds of pieces of evidence. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the killing had been premeditated and motivated by jealousy and rage at Alexander's decision to exclude her from the Cancun trip and to move on with his life. The defense argued that Arias had killed Alexander in genuine self-defense after he attacked her, pointing to her own testimony about the nature of the relationship. On the 8th of May, 2013, the jury found Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder. The penalty phase of the proceedings was lengthy and complex and involved 2 separate jury deliberations, and ultimately the death penalty was not imposed. Jodi Arias was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is the sentence she is currently serving at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. For the Alexander family, who sat through every day of a trial that required them to hear their brother's private life examined in the most public and invasive way imaginable, the conclusion of the case brought a measure of justice but not an end to the grief of having lost Travis in circumstances so senseless and so brutal. Number 5. Scott Peterson and the digital trail that proved a husband's betrayal. The disappearance of Lacey Denise Peterson on Christmas Eve of 2002 from her home in Modesto, California, became one of the defining true crime cases of the early 21st century. A story that gripped the American public for months and that ultimately turned on a web of digital evidence, phone records, internet searches, and recorded telephone conversations that together constructed an overwhelming picture of a husband who had been living a secret life while presenting the image of a devoted partner to the world. Laci Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with the couple's first child, a boy they had already decided to name Connor, when she was reported missing by her husband Scott Lee Peterson on the afternoon of the 24th of December, 2002. Scott told investigators that he had left their home that morning to go on a solo fishing trip to the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay, and that when he returned in the afternoon Laci was gone, along with the family's golden retriever Mackenzie, leading him to believe she had taken the dog for a walk and had not come back. The community of Modesto rallied immediately to help search for Laci, and her family became the public face of a desperate effort to bring her home, appearing regularly in the media and appealing for anyone with information to come forward. Scott Peterson joined those appeals and gave multiple media interviews in which he expressed his anguish over his wife's disappearance and his hope for her safe return. But investigators noticed almost immediately that something about Scott Peterson's manner and his account of events did not quite add up. There were inconsistencies in his story, a strange emotional detachment at moments where grief would have been expected, and details about his behavior in the days surrounding the disappearance that raised serious questions. The pivotal development that transformed the investigation came in January of 2003, when a 28-year-old massage therapist named Amber Fry came forward and told police that she had been in a romantic relationship with Scott Peterson since November of 2002, and that Peterson had told her he was not married. Fry had been entirely unaware of Laci's existence or her pregnancy. The revelation of the affair shattered the image Peterson had been projecting and provided investigators with what appeared to be a powerful potential motive. Fry agreed to cooperate with law enforcement, and in the weeks that followed Laci's disappearance she conducted recorded phone calls with Scott Peterson while investigators listened, calls in which Peterson continued to deceive her about his circumstances and in which the content of his statements was carefully documented and preserved as evidence. The digital and computer evidence gathered during the investigation added further critical layers to the case. Investigators examined Peterson's computer and found that he had conducted internet searches in the period before Laci's disappearance that were consistent, prosecutors argued, with someone researching currents and tides in San Francisco Bay, which was directly relevant to where Laci and Connor's remains were eventually found. Phone records and cell tower data placed Peterson's phone in the vicinity of the Berkeley Marina on the morning of Christmas Eve, consistent with his claimed alibi but also consistent with the prosecution's theory about where and how he had disposed of Laci's body. Peterson had sold Laci's sport utility vehicle in the early weeks after her disappearance, a decision that investigators found highly suspicious and that contributed to the mounting concern around his conduct. On the 13th and 14th of April, 2003, the bodies of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor were found washed ashore near the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay, not far from the spot where Peterson claimed to have been fishing on Christmas Eve morning. Both bodies showed evidence of time spent in the water, and forensic analysis was conducted to establish as much as possible about the circumstances of their deaths. Scott Peterson was arrested on the 18th of April, 2003 in San Diego, where he had been found with his hair dyed a different color, in possession of cash, his brother's identification, camping equipment, and items that prosecutors argued suggested he had been preparing to flee. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, 1 for Laci and 1 for Connor, and was held without bail. His trial began on the 1st of June, 2004 in Redwood City, California, following a change of venue from Modesto due to the impossibility of finding an impartial jury in the city where the case had been the dominant story for over a year. The proceedings lasted nearly 5 months and included the testimony of 174 witnesses. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, built from the digital evidence including the computer searches and phone records, the recorded calls with Amber Fry, the cell tower data, the location of the bodies near his stated fishing location, and the pattern of behavior that investigators argued was consistent only with guilt. Amber Fry testified powerfully about her relationship with Peterson and about the conversations she had recorded with him after Laci's disappearance, conversations in which he continued to deceive her even as the nation searched for his missing wife. On the 12th of November, 2004, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci and second-degree murder in the death of Connor. He was subsequently sentenced to death, a sentence that was later overturned by the California Supreme Court in 2020 on the grounds of juror misconduct during the selection process, and Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the sentence he is currently serving. The case has never entirely left the public consciousness, and in recent years the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced that it would be investigating Peterson's claim of actual innocence, focusing on new DNA evidence including a piece of duct tape found on Laci's clothing that had not been fully tested. The question of whether justice was fully served in the Peterson case remains a subject of genuine debate, but the role that digital evidence played in the investigation, from computer searches to phone records to the meticulously documented recorded conversations, established it as a landmark case in the use of electronic evidence in American criminal prosecutions. Number 6. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer who was caught by his own floppy disk. For 30 years, the city of Wichita, Kansas lived in the shadow of a killer who had given himself a name, who had written letters to the press describing his crimes in clinical and calculated detail, and who had vanished into silence so completely that many investigators had come to believe he was either dead or imprisoned for some unrelated crime. The man known as BTK, an acronym he had chosen himself standing for the method he claimed to use against his victims, bind, torture, kill, was Dennis Lynn Rader, born on the 9th of March 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, a man who was by the time of his arrest a church council president, a scout leader, a married father of 2, a compliance officer for the city of Park City, and a neighbor known to those around him as meticulous, even officious, in his concern for rules and order. The distance between what Dennis Rader presented to the world and what he had been doing in secret across the span of nearly 2 decades is one of the most disturbing examples of concealed criminality in the history of American law enforcement. Rader's first act of harm against others came on the 15th of January, 1974, when he targeted a family in their home on Edgemore Road in Wichita, taking the lives of Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and 2 of their children, Josephine and Joseph II, while 3 older Otero siblings were away at school and returned home that afternoon to discover what had happened. The Otero family killings were followed by additional attacks over the years and into the early 1980s, with Rader targeting individuals and households in the Wichita area and leaving behind evidence that consistently eluded investigators despite extensive effort. After his final documented attack in 1991, Rader went completely silent for 13 years. No letters, no evidence, no new crimes that could be attributed to him. Investigators could not determine whether he had stopped, moved away, died, or been imprisoned, and the case grew cold in a way that caused genuine anguish for the families of his victims who had waited decades for answers. In 2004, a local newspaper published a retrospective piece on the 30th anniversary of the Otero family attack, speculating about whether the BTK killer was still alive. This article, it would later become clear, had provoked something in Dennis Rader, a need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to reclaim the attention that his silence had allowed to drift away. He began sending packages to media organizations and to law enforcement, packages containing crime scene photographs, victim property, written accounts of his crimes, and taunting communications that confirmed beyond doubt that BTK was alive and had been living undetected in the community for over 3 decades. Investigators responded to each communication carefully, trying to extract any possible forensic or behavioral information that might lead them to the sender, and they began building a behavioral and analytical profile of who this person might be. In January of 2005, in one of the most remarkable exchanges in the history of criminal investigation, Rader sent a message to police asking whether it would be possible for him to communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced to a specific computer. Through a response placed in a classified advertisement, law enforcement indicated to him that it would be safe to do so. It was not. On the 16th of February, 2005, a small purple 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk arrived at the KSAS television station in Wichita. It contained a single visible file named tested.rtf, which held another taunting message from BTK. Officer Randy Stone of the Wichita Police Department recognized immediately that this digital medium might contain information beyond what the sender intended to share, and the disk was submitted to forensic examination. What the forensic analysts found in the metadata of the file, the hidden information that software embeds automatically in a document recording its origin and editing history, was the name Dennis and a reference to Christ Lutheran Church. A search of Christ Lutheran Church's records revealed that the Congregation Council president was a man named Dennis Rader. Investigators found a black Jeep Cherokee at Rader's home that matched a vehicle caught on surveillance footage from the delivery of an earlier BTK package. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but investigators needed biological confirmation, and they obtained a search warrant that allowed them to access medical records from a gynecological examination that Rader's daughter Carrie had undergone at Kansas State University's medical clinic. DNA analysis from those records produced a familial match to DNA that had been preserved from one of the original BTK crime scenes. A match that confirmed beyond scientific doubt that Dennis Rader and BTK were the same person. From the moment the floppy disk arrived at the television station to the moment Dennis Rader was taken into custody, 9 days had passed. Rader was arrested on the 25th of February 2005, and he quickly confessed to all 10 murders in a manner that investigators and observers described as deeply clinical and detached, referring to his victims as projects and describing his method of selecting them in language more appropriate to a bureaucratic process than to a discussion of taking human lives. In June of 2005, Rader entered guilty pleas to all 10 counts of first-degree murder. Because Kansas had not yet reinstated the death penalty at the time of Rader's crimes, he was not eligible for execution, and on the 18th of August 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, meaning he would be required to serve a minimum of 175 years before being eligible for any form of parole consideration. He is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. The irony at the heart of the BTK case is one that has been examined endlessly in the years since the arrest. Dennis Rader, a man who fancied himself a step ahead of the investigators who had been trying to find him for 30 years, was ultimately caught because he asked police whether a floppy disk could be traced to a computer, received their assurance that it could not, and then trusted that answer. Number 7. Philip Markoff, the medical student and the email address that ended everything. Philip Markoff was 23 years old, enrolled in his second year at Boston University School of Medicine, engaged to be married to a young woman named Megan McAllister, who described him to everyone she knew as the most beautiful person inside and out that she had ever met, and living in a comfortable apartment in Quincy, Massachusetts. On the surface, Markoff was the embodiment of promise and respectability, a young man from a small town in New York State who had excelled academically and who appeared to be on a trajectory toward a career as a physician. Beneath that surface, investigators would discover Markoff had accumulated over $130,000 in gambling debts from regular visits to casinos, and he had developed a hidden pattern of criminal behavior that targeted women who advertised services through the website Craigslist. On the 10th of April, 2009, a woman named Tricia Leffler, a 29-year-old escort who had been advertising through Craigslist, was restrained with plastic zip ties and robbed at gunpoint in her hotel room in Boston. She survived. Surveillance cameras in the hotel recorded a tall, slender man in a baseball cap in the corridor outside her room. 4 days later, on the 14th of April, 2009, a 26-year-old woman named Julissa Brisman, a model and masseuse from New York City who had been advertising therapeutic massage services through Craigslist, arrived at a room in the Marriott Copley Place Hotel in Boston expecting to meet a client who had contacted her through the platform. She never left that room alive. Brisman was found face down in the doorway of her room, her hands bound with plastic ties, having suffered gunshot wounds to her hip, lung, and heart. She was 26 years old. When detectives responded to the scene, they found a spent bullet casing, a cell phone, and Brisman's identification in a Gucci bag, but no clear indication of who her attacker had been. The digital investigation that followed moved with a speed that would have been impossible even a few years earlier. Julissa Brisman's friend provided investigators with an email address that had been used to contact Brisman in response to her Craigslist advertisement and to arrange the meeting at the hotel. Investigators submitted a legal request to Microsoft for the registration information associated with that email account. Microsoft's response revealed that the account had been created just minutes before it was used to contact Brisman and had never been used again, a pattern consistent with someone trying to avoid being traced. The IP address associated with the account's creation was provided to investigators, who then submitted a legal request to the internet service provider Comcast, which after some urgency on the part of law enforcement provided the name and address associated with that IP address. Philip Markoff, residing in Quincy, Massachusetts. Investigators began surveillance on Markoff and within days stopped him in his vehicle while he was driving to a casino with his fiancée Megan McAllister. A search of the couple's apartment produced a Springfield Armory semi-automatic handgun that had been hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the medical textbook Gray's Anatomy. Bullets that matched the ballistic evidence from the Brisbane crime scene, plastic zip ties identical to those used to restrain the victims, multiple prepaid untraceable phones, a laptop computer whose hard drive contained a record of Markoff's Craigslist correspondence with Julissa Brisbane, and 2 pairs of women's underwear later identified as belonging to Tricia Leffler. Markoff's blood-stained shoes were also recovered, and the blood on them was confirmed to have come from Julissa Brisbane. Markoff was arrested on the 21st of April, 2009, and was charged with murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. He pleaded not guilty. Megan McAllister initially stood publicly by her fiancé and expressed her belief in his innocence, but by June of 2009 she had visited him in jail and ended their relationship, and their planned wedding date of the 14th of August, 2009 came and went with Markoff in a cell at the Nashua Street Jail in Boston. The trial had been scheduled to begin in March of 2011, but on the 16th of August 2010, Philip Markoff was found dead in his jail cell. He was 24 years old. He had taken his own life. Because of his death, the charges against him were formally withdrawn, and the case was never tried before a jury. Prosecutors had been preparing what they described as an overwhelming case against him, and the Suffolk County District Attorney later released the full evidence file in an effort to provide as complete a public account of the investigation as possible. Julissa Brisbane's family expressed frustration that Markoff's death meant there would never be a trial, never a formal verdict, never a moment in which the evidence would be laid before a jury and a finding of guilt would be entered into the public record. The case of Philip Markoff was, among other things, a demonstration of the degree to which digital footprints had by 2009 become impossible to fully erase, and of how quickly a single IP address, traced through the proper legal channels and processed with urgency, could unravel even the most seemingly protected false identity. Number 8. Matt Baker, the pastor who searched for poison online and then called it a suicide. In the small community of Hewitt, Texas, a man named Matt Baker occupied a position of trust and moral authority as a pastor at a local Baptist church, a role that placed him at the center of his community's spiritual life and that required him to be, at least in the eyes of those who knew him, a person of integrity and compassion. Matt Baker was well regarded in his community, known for his work at the church, his involvement in youth ministry, and his life as a family man. His wife, Carrie Baker, was a 31-year-old elementary school teacher known for her dedication to her students and her warmth as a mother to the couple's 2 daughters. On the 24th of April, 2006, Matt Baker called emergency services to report that his wife had taken her own life by means of an overdose of sleeping pills, telling investigators that Carrie had struggled with depression in the aftermath of the couple's infant daughter, Cassidy, who had died of a brain tumor in 2002, and that she had apparently chosen to act on her despair. The medical examiner initially ruled Carrie Baker's death a suicide, consistent with Matt Baker's account, and for a period the case was closed on that basis. But Carrie Baker's family, particularly her father Jim Doolin, did not believe the suicide ruling. They knew Carrie, they knew her faith and her attachment to her 2 surviving daughters, and they did not believe she would have chosen to leave them. They began pushing for a reinvestigation, and their persistence eventually led law enforcement to take another look at the evidence. When investigators went back to the case and examined the digital evidence that had not been closely analyzed at the time of the original inquiry, they found something that changed everything. A forensic examination of the computer in the Baker household revealed that someone had conducted internet searches for information about the lethal effects of various sleeping medications, specifically researching which pills could cause death through overdose and at what quantities. The searches had been conducted before Carrie Baker's death. The specific drug that appeared in those searches was Ambien, the same medication that was found in Carrie Baker's system during the toxicological examination. Investigators also discovered evidence that cast serious doubt on Matt Baker's account of the evening in question, including testimony from a woman named Vanessa Bowles, who revealed that she had been in a romantic relationship with Matt Baker and that he had told her, before Carrie's death, that he wanted his wife out of his life and had discussed the possibility of ending their marriage by means other than divorce. The combination of the digital search history, which placed Matt Baker as someone who had been researching exactly the method used in his wife's death before that death occurred, and the testimony about his private statements and the extramarital relationship, built a case that prosecutors presented to a jury in 2010. Matt Baker was convicted of the murder of his wife Carrie Baker and was sentenced to 65 years in prison, a sentence that effectively means he will not be released in his lifetime. The case became one of the clearest early examples of internet search history being used as direct evidence of premeditation in a murder trial, demonstrating that the queries a person enters into a search engine can, when forensically recovered and presented in the proper context, serve as a window into intention and planning that would otherwise remain invisible to investigators. Number 9. Victor Serrano and the cold case Facebook search that found a killer 22 years later. In 1996, a 23-year-old woman named Manuela Dominguez was found in her apartment in Dallas, Texas, having been assaulted and strangled. She had a 6-month-old baby daughter named Daisy, who was found alone in a playpen beside her mother, having been there for approximately 8 hours. Investigators quickly identified an 18-year-old man named Victor Serrano as their primary suspect, as Serrano was the live-in partner of Manuela's cousin and was known to her, making him someone with access to her home. But when investigators sought to bring him in for questioning, Serrano had disappeared. Authorities believed he had returned to Mexico, and without extradition resources and the digital investigative tools that would later transform cold case work, the trail went cold. Manuela Dominguez's case sat unresolved for over 2 decades, and her daughter Daisy grew up without her mother, carrying the weight of a loss she had been too young to consciously remember but old enough to feel every day of her life. The breakthrough in the case came not from a scientific advance or a forensic laboratory but from a social media website. A long-lost cousin of Daisy Serrano Dominguez found her on Facebook and the two began communicating. And through those conversations the case of Daisy's mother came back to the surface. Daisy, by then 23 years old herself, contacted Dallas Police cold case detective No Camacho, who had been assigned to review the file. Camacho began using Facebook as an investigative tool to search for Victor Serrano, working through the social network's connections and profiles to try to locate a man who had been living under an assumed name for over 20 years. He found him. Serrano had been living in the state of Utah under a different identity, having built a life there that bore no visible connection to the crime he had committed in Dallas in 1996. He was arrested, and DNA evidence from biological material preserved at the original crime scene from 1996 was tested against a sample taken from Serrano following his arrest, producing a confirmed match that eliminated any remaining scientific doubt about his identity as the person responsible for Manuela Dominguez's death. Victor Serrano pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. At the sentencing, Daisy Serrano Dominguez addressed the man who had taken her mother's life and left her alone in a playpen as an infant, and she told him in court that while he claimed he would never hurt a child, he had in the end still hurt her, because growing up without a mother is a wound that never fully heals. The Serrano case is a testament to both the endurance of grief across decades and the unexpected ways in which justice can find a path forward when it seemed that all paths had been permanently closed. Number 10. Jaime Casabuana, the mother who named her killers in her final text. In the early hours of the 2nd of April, 2019, in the city of San Jose del Monte in Bulacan province in the Philippines, a 28-year-old woman named Jaime Casabuana sent a text message to her cousin. The message, written in Filipino, said that Wilson and his companion were at her home, that they were asking for water, and that they were drunk. It was a brief, matter-of-fact message, the kind a person might send to keep a family member casually informed about who had stopped by. But it was also, in ways that Jaime could not have fully understood in the moment she sent it, one of the most consequential pieces of evidence in the entire case that would follow, because it was the last message Jaime Casabuana ever sent, and it contained the names of the 2 men who would within a short time take her life and the lives of her 2 young sons, 8-year-old Anton Gabriel and 4-year-old Joaquin. Wilson Cortez, who was 23 years old at the time, was the live-in partner of Jaime's cousin, which was how he had come to be known to her and how he had access to her home. He had arrived with a companion named Joselito Cortez, who was 48 years old, and both men were under the influence of alcohol and, according to police, also of crystal methamphetamine. The 2 men entered Jaime's home and a confrontation took place. Casabuana's 2 sons, Anton, Gabriel, and Joaquin, were present. All three members of the family, Jaime and both of her children, lost their lives that night in circumstances that investigators described as among the most tragic they had encountered. The attackers took Jaime's mobile phone after she sent the text message and sold it for the equivalent of just a few Philippine pesos to cover their ongoing desire to drink. But the text message had already been sent. It was already sitting in her cousin's inbox, carrying the names of the two men responsible. When relatives of the family arrived the following evening after Jaime had not responded to further messages, they found the three of them and immediately contacted police. The text message Jaime had sent hours earlier was immediately provided to investigators, and it gave them exactly what they needed: the names of the individuals who had been present at the home in the period leading up to the deaths. Wilson Cortez and Joselito Cortez were identified, located, and taken into custody the following day and were presented to the Philippine National Police Chief at a press conference confirming the case had been resolved. Both men admitted during questioning that they had been under the influence of substances and had intended to steal in order to fund further drinking. The investigation into Jaime Casabuana's case became a powerful and heartbreaking illustration of the degree to which a single digital communication, sent in a moment of ordinary life before anything had gone wrong, can survive its sender and speak on that person's behalf long after they are gone. Jaime Casabuana did not know that her text message would become evidence. She did not know that the casual few words she typed to her cousin would be the thing that brought the men responsible for what happened to her and to her children to justice. She was simply a mother sending a message, the way millions of people do every single day, and in that ordinary act she left behind the one piece of information that mattered most. The case of Jaime Casabuana and her sons Anton, Gabriel, and Joaquin stands as a reminder that in the age of digital communication, the record of our lives does not end when we do, and that sometimes the most important words a person ever sends are the ones they never imagined would matter to anyone except the person they were written for.